Welcome to everybody, both in person and online, and especially welcome to the new batch of Kent-Kew Ethnobotany Master students. It's really marvelous to see you here and marvelous to see you here in person as well. And many thanks to Raj to the invitation to speak. And I was in some doubts about accepting that invitation. I've been lucky enough to attend perhaps all but one of these talks, from Wade Davis exploring the Amazon in 1999, very hard for anyone to top that, I think, to Christian and Brigitte Vogel bringing us the sound of cowbells from the Austrian Alps, to Nancy Turner from Canada, her wonderful advocacy of indigenous foods and lifeways. And these talks tend to follow a standard pattern. Something about where the speakers come from. I'm going to do that. I'm going to introduce you to some of my teachers. Wonderful photos of where they worked, some data from field work and its implications, and an inspiring message for the Kent students. I think I can manage the first part. I introduce you to my teachers. It's a great opportunity to acknowledge some debts. And I'll do my best on the inspiring message side. But my field work since arriving at Kew has mainly been in the unglamorous surroundings of museum collections, the realm of double basements, of breeze block walls, of buckets under leaking sewage pipes, this world, and in libraries and archives, often at Kew, generally without the buckets. Well, actually, no, with and without the buckets at Kew and elsewhere. But it's my mission to persuade you this evening, but often alongside and integrated with field work, and you'll see this popping up a few times, but these historic collections have a lot to offer the field of ethnobotany. So first, I'd like to introduce you to some of my teachers. I'd like to start with Barbara Pickerskill, very much still with us in North Yorkshire, the world's great expert on pepper domestication, chili pepper domestication. And I co-organized her retirement due with the Nairn Society. It was extraordinary. Students flew from all around the world to attend that event. The cytogeneticist, and someone who is really well connected to everybody working on domestication and archaeobotany, archaeological remains and archaeological sites back in the 1960s and 1970s, and someone who gave me the free run of her office in the days before the internet. For people, younger people in the audience, people used to send printed versions of their papers to everyone else to read. I have now inherited, in fact, quite a lot of Barbara's collection myself. I still like to work with paper. Now, something I'm not going to talk about this evening is the deep history of ethnobotany, the stories of crop domestication, the wonderful work done by my colleague Oscar Perez and others at Kew on unraveling the date genome from archaeological remains and economic botany collection. Remains are a really deep and fascinating area to me. But today we're mainly going to talk about the 19th century. It's mainly where Kew's collections are located. My other teachers, Gordon Hillman, who many of you will know, well worth tracking down with Ray Mayers, a wonderful series of television programs on YouTube, but wonderfully capture his personality and knowledge. Terrifying teacher in some ways, in the way that he assumed that every student was multilingual and expert as he was, but the most charismatic of teachers, seeded around about 100 PhD students into museums and departments all over the world. And then David Harris, like Gordon, in the Institute of Archaeology at University College London, very different personality, almost always to be seen in a very smart suit. This is an unusual shot of him here. And David taught a wonderful course called Resources and Subsistence, still taught today at the Institute. Widely remembered by anyone who's been through it as highly influential, in which he looked at the global patterns of food and subsistence, drawing on his own incredible travels. Everything was illustrated with color slides. And that course is still taught today by Dorian Fuller at UCL. In many ways, David Harris's successor is someone with a global view. And I didn't fully appreciate David at the time, but I have come to appreciate in the 40 or so years since how influential he was on my thinking. Now, there are lots of other people who've taught me, I'm still learning today, and many of their names are going to come up in this talk. Now, not a huge amount's been written on the history of ethnobotany. I'm going to return to why has not a lot been written in a second. But Wade Davis, writing in 1995, drawing on the work of Dick Ford and others, defined kind of three key stages in the history of ethnobotany. Utilitarianism or bioprospecting, very much focused on useful plants, at a time when ethnobotany and botany were more or less the same thing, strongly aligned to medicinal plants. And then moving on to salvage ethnobotany and then modern ethnobotany as we have it today. And here I have three illustrations to show that era really extended certainly up to the early 20th century. In some respects, it's still with us, of course, of bioprospecting. So the hunt for medicinal plants you see on the left in the title page of Francisco Hernandez, Flora of New Spain, of South America, and the beginning of the arrival of tropical drugs into Europe on a huge scale. Then Linnaeus, often credited as being the first European ethnobotanist, fascinated by Sami culture in Lapland, as Elizabeth Rousing points out in her biography of Linnaeus, this version of Sami dress is something that no Sami man would wear. It's far too plain. But Linnaeus traveled Europe giving lectures about Sami culture and is, of course, particularly famous for his attempts to introduce tea cultivation into Sweden, a doomed enterprise if there ever was one. And then moving on to Strophanthus and the really interesting story, still not fully explored, still there as a research project around the intersection between arrow poisons and anesthesia. And I particularly like this story because it's a 19th century story. And so many historians are drawn to the 18th century. Kew is really founded as a science institution in 1840. Most of our collections are high Victorian. So I've always been very naturally drawn to the 19th century, not least because in Britain we can see so strongly the connections with the 19th century. I wish that more historians would work on this difficult, sometimes ugly period. And there's been some really great in-depth studies of this age of bioprospecting. I highlighted a few here: The Secret Cures of Slaves, The Shadow of Slavery, and Abina Dov Asura's Bitter Roots, in which she delves into that Strophanthus story from the 19th century. We move on to era of salvage ethnobotany, strongly aligned to salvage anthropology in North America in the late 19th century, looking at the 1890s. And here, and it's no coincidence, but in 1896, John Harshberger coined the term ethnobotany in North America in the 1890s. And I've chosen to exemplify this period Edward Palmer, who you see with some of his collections here. And he collected overall around about 100,000 ethnobotanical and botanical specimens in Mexico, many of which are at Kew, but most of which are at the Smithsonian collection. Why have I chosen Palmer? For two reasons, really. One, that the Smithsonian has made a really great effort to digitize all of Palmer's notes and his collections to make them available for biocultural revitalization in Mexico. They are indeed a precious record of plant use now 140 years ago. And secondly, because Edward Palmer is the figure chosen by two of Mexico's leading ethnobotanists, Bob By and Edelmiro Linares, to focus on alongside their life's work in ethnobotany. They can recognize that the Palmer's legacy is really important to Mexican ethnobotany today. Moving on to what we might call modern ethnobotany, which I would define as originating in the 1980s and the 1990s, and the work of people such as Gary Martin and Tony Cunningham, both associated with Kent at different, and indeed Kew at different times. And this was a shift to ecological quantifiable methodologies, which meant you could generate data from the work of a particular community that could be compared to results from other communities, would enable you to, for example, to do brilliant circum-Mediterranean work on the use of wild plant foods. And it had a really strong ethical basis. This is when we understood that the work of a community, you need an invitation from that community, and that your goals, even if they are in the form of your work is looking for new medicines, your goals are above all to support that community, to return improved medicines or indeed money back into the community. And this was marked by the development of codes of ethics. So Darrell Posey, for example, International Society of Ethnobiology, a very key figure in this, and events such as the Rio Convention in 1992. And that era of modern ethnobotany is often broken down to different stages: cognitive ethnobotany, ethnoecology, indigenous ethnobiology. Whether we can really tease those apart, I'm not sure. And the latest of those phases, stage 6, has been presented in this recent paper, Ethnobiology Phase 6, Decolonizing Institutions, Projects and Scholarships, which rose from the acknowledgement among both indigenous and non-indigenous ethnobiologists. But the Code of Ethics, the ISC Code of Ethics 2006, is very good. It forces you to look deep at your work, but it is not addressing structural inequalities in the field around publication, access to collections, access to resources. And it is time again to look deep into ourselves and think, how can we do better? Returning to this idea about broader history, well, what put this into my mind, my honorary base at Royal Holloway is in geography. And it's led me to quite a lot of readings on the history of geography. In fact, the title of this talk is adapted from a fascinating, provocative paper, Awakening the Dead. And in particular, work by Felix Driver, his book Geography Militant, Cultures of Exploration and Empire, prefigured by a whole range of papers by Felix and other geographers. There are textbooks on the history of geography. It's routinely taught in geography. And you could argue that ethnobotany is too new or too narrow or not really a discipline. And that explains why we don't have that wealth of history. But the same is actually true of plant sciences or botany in general. Now, the last synthetic history of botanical science was published by Morton back in the 1980s. And there are very few books that take the broader scale of the ambition of, think of Jim Endersby's Imperial Nature, fascinating study of how networks of correspondence were maintained in the 19th century Kew herbarium, or Kate Telcher's Palace of Palms, ostensibly about Kew's palm house, and in fact far broader in its scope, about how Victorian Britain interacted with the tropics. And I would love to see more of this kind of work. What I want to avoid is jumping forward 15 slides. So, there we go. Now, in a moment, I'm going to talk about Kew's 19th century ethnobotanical collections. Of course, these have an earlier history, and this is something that we're just starting, I think, to unravel and to see how they do or don't connect with Kew's collections. So the Natural History Museum holds Sloane's vegetable substances, one of the founding collections of the British Museum, of course. Like all Sloane's work, deeply implicated in slavery through his early career as a physician and collector in plantation Jamaica, and through funding from his wife's ownership of slave plantations. And this collection has sat in the British Museum, now in the Natural History Museum, since the 1750s, unused. But now through wonderful work by Victoria Pickering and reading for this talk, I came across a paper I hadn't seen in Journal of History of Collections about the collection. It's now fully catalogued and really interesting analysis is starting on its contents. And its contents both include Materia Medica, as you see here. Materia Medica collections have a longer, very interesting parallel history of economical ethnobotany collections, but are much wider in scope. And then you see on the right another collection that I'm working with, the Clarkson Chest and Wisbeach Museum. Wisbeach might not be on your holiday list, but it should be, because the Wisbeach Museum is like the British Museum, but a little smaller. There's an astonishing small town museum in the fens of eastern England. Thomas Clarkson is a forgotten figure amongst the general public in the abolition of the slave trade, but according to historians that I've read, was the crucial figure who both persuaded the public, but more importantly, brought the politicians together and saw the act through Parliament. One of the tools that he used in that long battle was the Clarkson chest, formed by traveling around British ports in 1784, asking sailors for products from West Africa to put in the chest. That includes many tens of seeds and fruits, West African rice, for example, perhaps the earliest example in any collection. And this was used both to demonstrate the high level of civilization in West Africa, but also the economic potential of different forms of trade. And the contents of this chest have never really been studied, but are really quite eye-opening. This is work that I'm doing with one of our volunteers, John Gale, now a PhD student at the Linnean Society. So Kew's Economic Botany, Museum of Economic Botany, starts in 1847 under the directorship of William Hooker. It rapidly expands into buildings that, if you know Kew, you will recognize. The School of Horticulture, Museum number 2, Museum number 1, now the Botanical, a few display cases left in there. The Timber Museums are the Orangery, the Cafe, and then Museum number 4 is Cambridge Cottage. If you get married at Kew, you may well have been in Cambridge Cottage. And then the 1980s, as part of a wider pattern of what happened to this kind of collection in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s that I'll talk about, the collection is decanted into a research store in the Banks building where it sits today. The Museum of Economic Botany has been shown, particularly by the work of Caroline Cornish, who's here with us in the audience, to be an inspiration for similar collections all around the world. In Kolkata, the Indian Museum, still very much there and on display, and we are talking about collaboration with the current curator right at the moment. In Adelaide, at the wonderful Botanic Garden there, beautifully restored. Those are two of the collections still very much on show. In Warrington Museum, again, might not be on your holiday list, but this small town up near Manchester has the first local authority funded museum in the UK, and its holdings are amazing. It's one of the very few museums to retain a complete botanical gallery full of contents from Kew. We'll come back to why that is. And then the Missouri Botanic Garden, which, like many botanical gardens, destroyed its collection, Edinburgh as well, in the 1960s, and has been rebuilding, has about reopened its museum, which, as you can see, is exactly modeled on the museum at Kew. Now, these collections around the world have a sad history in the second half of the 20th century. The style of showing botany, having raw materials and finished products, leads to very busy cabinets, and plants themselves, of course, went out of fashion in the 50s and 60s, replaced by oil as a new material of choice. At this point, many collections are decanted into storage, split between other collections, or indeed destroyed. And I'm very lucky, really, to have worked in the era, particularly since the Rio Convention, particularly since the early 90s, I think, where the sustainability and general coolness of plants is increasingly recognized. Makes my job a lot easier. What do you find in the Museum of Economic Botany? This is some of the 100,000 objects you'll find in the Kew collection, ranging from medicinal plants to combs, to bark cloth shirts in the Amazon, to a spear thrower from Australia, textiles from India. The flat pack in card is of stinging nettle fiber produced in the Second World War. Jamaican lace bark we'll come to again later. Scandinavian collections, big British collections, often forgotten as well. And in general, it's a collection that represents everyday life. It's broad, mostly relatively shallow, but there are pockets of depth, which we'll come to. And there's some special attributes about what this collection collected compared to what anthropology museums collected at the same time, that I'll come back to later. It's accompanied by really extensive archives that we're very lucky to have on site in the library and archives. Something I'm still grappling with, untangling in my mind, is the bigger picture of where this kind of collection, what today we might call an ethnobotany collection or a biocultural collection, because it combines biology and culture, how it fits into the bigger picture of the relationship between nature and society. And many historians look to perhaps the 1550s, the mid-16th century, as a time at which nature and society are separated. And they link that separation to the rise of capitalism, and they link it to the rise of colonialism. And they would often point out that people of color were often considered to be nature and thus a resource to be exploited. And so this is a deeply implicated division. Now, the Economic Botany collection was founded in 1847. It represents the world of its time, a complex intersection of trade and empire. Neither alone explains the collection by itself. I suppose one of my big long-term questions to myself, I may partly answer in this talk, is whether you can take a collection grounded in past ways of thinking, pull out an element that is attractive today. And the element that's attractive today is that the Economic Botany collection doesn't make a division between nature and culture. It's about human ingenuity and the use of natural resources. This is why attempts to divide these collections, but half in the natural history collection and half in the ethnographic collection, as many museums have done, don't work. A lump of rubber doesn't sit in either kind of collection. And I think there is an attractive element there, one that we can use to think again about our relationships with nature a little bit counterintuitively. So during this summer, I've been doing weekend walks in the East End of London and in the city with Aurora Prain, an American researcher, we'll see her later, who combines deep experience in the tea industry with a training in the Kent program in ethnobotany. And using old maps, we've been tracing the lines, the roots of tea in London, the psychogeography, as writers like to say, of tea in London. And a few things have really struck me doing that. One is the sheer scale of the London docks, not all involved in tea imports. And you can see here on the map, you can see that line from in the west, London docks around the Tower of London, St. Catherine Dock, running all the way to the Royal Docks in the east. And then the peninsula in the center, we have the West India Docks, today the site of Canary Wharf. So if you've been to Canary Wharf, you think about the size of that area. I found some amazing drone shots I couldn't get permission to use in this talk. That's a big area. It gives you an idea of the scale of these dock basins, as does the aerial photograph here, taken in the early 20th century. And it really brought home to me the scale of commodity import into Britain. And it's not rocket science to any economic historian, but sometimes, sitting looking at a Scots tea leaf on a herbarium specimen or a little box of palm oil, fruits from West Africa, you can see these small boxes and forget the scale that they connect to. And this is a point that's made really well. There's a quote by Richard Drayton that Caroline often uses in her talks. It really makes the point that Britain is the home of the Industrial Revolution by the mid-19th century. by the time of the foundation of the collection, has extraordinary advanced machinery and industry, but all of that is dependent on imports. So the raw materials we have in Britain are coal, iron ore, water, and grass. So it's very good for railway engines and beef, and not very good for anything else. And this is why these docks, which are not the only docks in Britain, of course, Liverpool, Bristol, and elsewhere, exist on such a huge scale. And this has been leading me to think not only about ethnobotany's global history, but environmental history as a more and more comfortable home for a lot of the work that we do here. Thinking about the impact of consumption in Britain on the plantations, on the hillsides, on the workers around the world. Something articulated really well in Luke Cow's recent book on the Wardian case, moving from that simple wooden box to thinking about global impacts. There are other things that have struck me. This was a big trade. It had a big impact on Britain. It's very little marked. If you go to the site of East India House, now the site of the Lloyd's building, that amazing shiny building in the city of London, there is a blue plaque. That blue plaque is to the founder of the Penny Post in 1600. The East India Company is simply erased. A small part of the building survives unmarked. Plantation House, the great center of the tea trade in the 1930s, rebuilt in the 1980s and shortly after renamed with a street number for it. The Museum of Docklands is the one wonderful place where you will find in the West India docks really fantastic explanations of how wealth flowed, how power flowed, how labor was controlled. Outside the Museum in Docklands, you'll find the stump of a statue to Robert Milligan, slave trader, founder of the West Indies docks, erected here as recently as 1997 and removed at community request in 2020. A reminder of the ongoing discussion about what values we want to memorialize in public spaces. So in all of these aspects, I thinking about revealing history, understanding scale, understanding UK history as global, I think ethnobotanical collections have an important role to play. And this is something we've explored with Royal Holloway, with Felix Driver, Caroline Cornish, and other colleagues through the Mobile Museum project. When you have overall about 100,000 specimens, that's about 70,000 historic Kew specimens. That is a significant database for looking at the flow of ethnobotanical material and what that tells you about Britain's relationship with the world. You can see just first in the overall pattern, orange line shows you what's coming into the collection, sharp rise in 1847, a decline, a terminal decline by the Second World War, as other institutes took on that work and Kew became more the Biodiversity Institute recognized today. There's also a surprise, something that Caroline spotted in her PhD thesis. The blue line is exits from Kew, recorded in a separate series of books, and representing tens of thousands of events in which material was sent to individuals and institutions around the world. This is what prompted us to undertake the Mobile Museum project, was to look at what Kew was sending out, to where it was sending it, and why it was sending it. And using the museum entry books and the exit books, we can look at how material entered Kew. You can see here, I think, a really interesting mix, more mixed than I expected when I pulled up this pie chart earlier today to drop into the talk, but private collectors and expeditions, perhaps accounting for about a quarter of the collection, traders and manufacturers representing a commercial orientation, botanic gardens, museums and exhibitions. And all of this data is available to you online, both digested on the project website, but also I'm really proud to say all of our entry books and exit books up to 1924 are online. And I wish that more museums would bring that transparency to their collections. If you visit the Biodiversity Heritage Library, you can turn through these pages and see a lot of very familiar names. And the patterns that we found were I think, really fascinating. The literal teasing apart of objects, such as this tinder from Afghanistan, one specimen held at Kew, one held at Brisbane, doubtless others elsewhere, material distributed all over the world. And then you can see on the bottom left, the flow of objects via Kew. So these are not direct flows, the flow of objects via Kew into Australia. And you see the biggest of those blue lines represents Indian objects coming via the India Museum in London, dissolved in 1879, and flowing out through Kew to other organizations around the world. So you not only have commodities moving around the world, have ethnobotanical knowledge in the form of specimens flowing around the world as well. And that brings me then to one of those commodity materials. And this is new work, started with Aurora in October 2019, moved online for a couple of years, and then was picked up again through sponsorship from Dennis Short, who you see just to Aurora's side in the middle of the photograph, who was able to come back this summer and extend the work. We have around about 400 tea specimens in the collection. Like many of the other commodities, they're not easy collections to work with. We also have several hundred jars of coffee beans. Aaron Davis, a coffee expert, has put to very good use, several hundred jars of cocoa beans. It's hard to tell a story of these, but because of Aurora's background, you see Aurora in the photograph here, she'll be able to bring that industry expertise, taken together with the catalogue of the collection, these wonderfully detailed guides as to not only list what's in the cases, but guide you as to how you should see and understand and learn from these collections. These are very much teaching collections. What Aurora's eye has brought to bear, for example, a really early sample of Assam tea here from the beginnings of tea plantations in India, using the Indian subspecies of tea, but prepared in a Chinese manner, because the knowledge of how to make tea came for a Western market, came through Chinese workers who were hired and came to India. So this is really material that represents the turning point and major supplies of tea coming to Europe from China to coming from India, then of course from Africa and other parts of the world. Another unassuming specimen that I had overlooked for many years is a pu'er tea you see in the tin canister. For those of you who know tea, pu'er tea is a wonderful thing. It's like a wine. It has a terroir, gets better with age. This tea was sampled when it arrived at Kew, and I think some of this particular block was rehydrated and stuck into the archive, the miscellaneous supports volumes. We speculate it may also have been drunk. And I know that tea experts are very keen to sample this, and it will be a drinkable tea. It's a well-aged, extremely valuable, under lock and key, I hasten to add, tea. And this is what happens when you bring expert knowledge of many different kinds. In the first photo, you saw retired tea industry experts in the UK. One really important audience for us, or group of experts of whom to work, but not the only one. And then you see here some old man's eyebrows. Those of you who remember Dennis Healy, the Labour politician, will recognize that appositeness of that name. It is extraordinary bundled teas, unrecognized by anybody in the British tea industry or by Aurora herself. And we've been channeling away through the internet for experimental work up in Scotland, recreating these using Scottish tea leaves. And then an email that came in just a couple of days ago from Hong Kong, suggesting there is one particular part of China that still produces these, but they're not reaching the international market. So one of the main themes of Aurora's project has been around how biocultural diversity, as well as history, is captured in this collection. It's led to us establishing a new tea collection at Kew. So we can look both at 19th century and 21st century teas, sometimes in the same plantations even. And we can also think about whether there are opportunities to reintroduce diversity into the kinds of teas that we drink today. Aurora's hoping to come back and do a PhD on this, and this story I hope will develop. I'm just going to make a short detour here into the strange case of Indian yellow. So T.N. Mukherjee, as is most often known in Kew circles, was an extraordinary Indian polymath, a great scientist of natural products, the go-to man if you had an international exhibition but needed filling with the wonders of the Indian natural world and Indian agriculture, extremely scholarly man, and someone that I think we'd like to do some more work on, particularly on the Kew relationship, and the kind of figure who, until quite recently, it's no longer true, would have been overlooked in the histories of these exhibitions and institutions. And one of Mukherjee's many projects in the 1880s was working a sort of Indian yellow, a wonderful luminous yellow pigment used by Vermeer in some of his paintings, for example, and of very mysterious origin. But rumors circulated that this came from a part of India. Mukherjee traveled there, found that cows are being fed mango leaves, where urine is being collected and evaporated in clay pots, and that this was the source of this extraordinary dye. And we have at Kew the clay pot, the cloth in which it was strained, samples collected by Mukherjee from the village where Indian yellow was being made, as well as specimens from the Indian Museum and elsewhere. I've known about this material for a long time. It's been on our catalogue for a long time, and the link with the Kew Bulletin paper is extremely easy to find online. And this didn't stop. A book on colours in 2002 suggesting that Mukherjee lied, but he made up this story. I can only guess at the motivations for that, but it always seemed odd to me because the actual specimens that he collected were at Kew, but also I could view this work in the context of a lifetime of really high quality work, a work that often focused on bringing forward Indian village crafts that have been overlooked by other art historians, for example. Unfortunately, as is so often the case, this story has taken the wing together with whole mythologies about Robert Fortune smuggling tea. I do occasionally write emails to people who post blogs to write papers about this. I don't usually get a reply. If I do, people often refuse to change what they write. And this is one of the areas that most troubles me, really, is if we do more subtle and nuanced history, how can we get those stories back out into circulation to replace distortions of history? And I might return back to that later. One of my heroes. Now I'm going to run through a few more case studies of work with a collection. I'm just giving you some tiny snapshots here, focusing on things in which I've had a hand. We have many visitors to the collection of carrying out independent research as well. We could easily make this talk much longer. We're going to look at this extraordinary material, Jamaican lace bark. You can see an image of the plant here with this, as you can see also in the photograph of the branch. You can simply take the inner bark, the phloem tubes that carry sugars from the leaves down to the roots, and tease them apart in multiple layers of natural lace. And lace is normally a very slow, very expensive, very high value product. This is something you can make entirely naturally. And Kew has more lace bark than anywhere else in the world in the form of these products, the fan that you see, the bonnet, the little purses, and the great exhibition in 1851. And this remarkable fan here, a recent donation from Marianne Moore. And this fan has a remarkable story. It was in the collections of the Panacea Society in Bedford, a millennial society that was suspecting the end of the world, and whose members sent in gifts from around the world in order to furnish the houses in Bedford, which grew to be many, with global products. We Last believer died out in the 1950s, and the society started auctioning the contents of those houses until wiser heads intervened in the 1980s. So this had been bought with Kew in mind back in the 1980s. Now, why does Kew have more lace spark than anywhere else? Wayne Modest, ethnographer now in the Netherlands, has written a really interesting paper based on a visit to the Kew collection, drawing attention to the disparity in the amount of cultural material at Kew compared to, let us say, the British Museum or the Pitt Rivers Museum. And there's very little in other museums in the 19th century. UK museums don't really start collecting the Caribbean until the 1960s. And this is because the Caribbean is viewed as being neither American nor African, and therefore not fitting into Victorian evolutionary schemes of society, whereas botanists are far more indiscriminate. The collecting mission for the Museum of Economic Botany was useful or curious. We know from letters with donors and with collectors that people interpreted that in many different ways and sometimes apologized for what the diversity and quirkiness of what they're sending to Kew. And this has led us to reflect, as all museums should, on that unequal distribution of collections, not just within the UK, not too much about that now, but between the UK and Jamaica. Jamaica does have a national museum, the Institute of Jamaica, but its holdings are small compared to ours. So when Marion offered us another lace spark piece, like many other British museums, we asked ourselves for Victorian object, is Kew the right place for it, or should it return to Jamaica? And really pleased that one of our students took it back to the Institute of Jamaica this summer. That may well be an increasing trend. This is the material we know relatively little about. It's harvested sustainably in the past, for sure, from wild trees up in maroon country in the high central mountains of Jamaica, and then traded down into the coast, where it was made, for example, by orphaned children into gifts for sale to souvenirs. And within 10 years of the beginning of the tourist trade in Jamaica, there are already reports that lace spark is becoming hard to find. And this does raise the concern. There's a lot of interest in reviving lace spark use. It's more or less died out in the 1960s. It needs to be revived sustainability. Here, local knowledge, people such as Derek Lennon and now descendants within the Lennon family is going to be really important in that work. This is work that we carried out with Emily Brennan, a conservator, with colleagues at the Institute of Jamaica, and with Steve Buckbridge, a costume historian, Jamaican historian in the United States. And I think a really nice trading of botanical and cultural information, and our publications overlap, I think, in very nice and neat ways. And it was really striking in a recent book, Victorian Jamaica, but authors who offered the opportunity to include vignettes of Jamaican material culture in the book. A lavish production from Duke University Press. If you have any interest in the Caribbean, you must read it. And many authors chose objects from the Economic Botany collection to feature in that book. There is new work going on lace spark, being probed by James Lucas from Missouri Botanic Garden, an expert in paper making, again working with the marine communities and with the Institute of Jamaica. And I'm really excited to see this tree sustainably used, perhaps entering cultivation. And this wonderful material, which has problematic historical associations, because it was used to make whips in the era of slavery, come back into use as a high value product. Another project became a 3-year project working with Smithsonian, University of Glasgow, which came through to a conclusion, whereas lace spark, I say, is a project that started and needs others to finish it, is working on Polynesian bark cloth, or tapper cloth as it's often called. You see some wonderful examples here in the collection, the millipede from the Cook Islands, the hand-printed piece from Tahiti, and the two lower pieces from Samoa. And you see here Andy Mills, the museum ethnographer and art historian on the project, standing next to coppiced paper mulberry trees, still used in Hawaii today. for tapa production. And here the issue is that many islands in Polynesia lost tapa production with the arrival of woven cloths and through assimilation or forced assimilation. And tapa production has often been revived, but there's been a break in production, a break in traditional knowledge. Knowledge now resides in tapa sitting in collections, primarily, in fact, in Polynesia. The Bishop Museum in Hawaii has 3,000 pieces of tapa, but also in very well-documented collections at Kew, the Hunterian Museum in Glasgow and elsewhere. And by bringing together Andy Mill's expertise in art history, his work, as you can see, the bottom left, with makers in Hawaii and in the Cook Islands, working with makers and looking at museum collections as well, and makers coming to Glasgow to demonstrate techniques of tapa making and examine material together, Kew as well, together with technical art history, applying chemical analysis. It's impossible to more or less rewrite the history of tapa in Polynesia by bringing together all of those other attributes. That's one of the possibilities that materials such as this in different museums, in different places with different skills offers. And this work is, skip over this story. This work is available now in 2 books came out that project, quite a few papers, and a fantastic database full of information designed to share information, particularly back to makers. Now we'll look at the story of Richard Spruce, known to many of you as one of the most extraordinary plant collectors in Latin America, foundational in the collecting of species new to science between the 14 years from 1850 onwards, both in the Amazon and in the Andes. His collections have been the basis of a long-running project since 2015 with no end date fixed, working my colleague William Milliken, very experienced Amazonian ethnobotanist at Kew, with Luciana Martins at Birkbeck, who's leading the current phase of the project, and with colleagues at ISA, the Social Environmental Institute in Brazil, the Federation of Indians of the Rio Negro in Northwest Brazil, where Spruce collected, and Rio de Janeiro Botanic Garden. And it gives an idea, and I'll talk a little bit at the end about this, about the importance of collaboration in this kind of work. And Spruce is exceptional because he collected herbarium material, he collected ethnobotanical artifacts, and as we have found out for the first time in this project, he connected the herbarium specimens to the artifacts. In other words, he collected voucher specimens. If only he had published a paper on the importance of doing that, it would have saved a lot of work in the 1980s, persuading ethnobotanists to start collecting herbarium specimens, as the students have been learning how to do today. And this is a project with collections history at its basis. This is some of the work we've done on reconnecting the herbarium specimens to the artifacts, working with indigenous peoples in the Rio Negro in visits in both directions. And at the moment, very much in conversations actually about how we do this kind of work. And what are the outcomes of this work going to be? And how do you have those conversations in a time of COVID over Zoom to village schoolrooms on what are really quite complex subjects? And I think we've got really interesting outcomes in the last stage of work. And one of those outcomes is, are you getting any news? That's a dirty movement. There was a sailor who accompanied a group of 5 participants in summer of 2019. Actually handling pain. The miraculous effect of this. Similar, how can I put it, engagement of took place at the British Museum in Berlin. This is something I don't think it would have been possible to take place in the museum 10 years ago. It's an example of the closer interaction taking place between museum and indigenous community. I think very much of us will run back there. Also one that's really interested in filming. Really important for capturing the and I would just make a brief mention here from the wonderful book, Through the Longhouse, Through the Molucca, illustrated by Lindsay Sokulovich, one of our PhD students is working on the project, bringing together the history of the objects, where they are now, how you work with Western museum curators, and design for use in high schools in the Amazon, one of the key outcomes of the project. So there are lots of different stories. As I said, one of the things that I want to do is to share the nuance and complexity of those stories with wider publics. How do we do that? Here's a couple of examples that we're able to do through the Mobile Museum project, working with our wonderful learning team here at Kew. You can see on the right, reoccupying, reopening Museum number 2, that very first Museum of Economic Botany. It started in 1960. Now home to the School of Horticulture, and I hope the School of Horticulture one day finds a wonderful home somewhere else. But there's an opportunity in this new room to make complex, interesting displays where we can talk, as we don't at the moment, about Kew's history, about useful plants, about where we are today with useful plants. And then we also ran a project in 2 primary schools and areas of high deprivation in London, revisiting the school museum. We sent out packets, boxes of material in the late 19th century to 600 school museums around the UK, the time when teaching objects was in vogue. The Victorians are not always as backwards as we might think. There are things that we can learn. And we took the opportunity to ask, how can you use ethnobotany in schools today? With really interesting outcomes, which we have published, which you can find on the Mobile Museum Project website, around not only do people learn more about where do things come from, but plants are a really good way of having intergenerational communication and knowledge exchange. And in fact, addressing one of the big issues in ethnobotany is loss of knowledge between generations. That's work we'd like to take further. Alice Proctor written a wonderful book called The Whole Picture, addressing this question not only of where are the difficult histories in the museums, first half of the book, the second half of the book, how do you address these? How, in a botanic garden context, for example, how can we convey complexity and nuance? Really delighted working with artist Shiraz Baiju of Mauritian heritage, of indentured laborer heritage associated with the sugar industry, and Nicolas Faubert, a dancer from Paris, in a long ongoing project for the last year or so with a Delphina Foundation, working in the medium of film, but I hope that we can show at Kew. That's an ongoing discussion about where we do that at the moment. And I have got some dance for you. We'll see if this works. Oh, yes. You'll have to add a slightly jazzy musical backdrop in your mind. You can see the farmhouse in the background. And this is one of a number of lines of work with artists that I'm doing other days that we're increasingly looking to interlink together, a flow of art from working with our collections rather than having to.
The company pays us cutters for the amount of cane we cut. And they won't stand for no trash being with the cane. No, sir. You have to cut off the top and then take the trash off the side before you get the cane proper. In the olden days, they used to make the slaves cut all the cane.
So this material is online. I warmly recommend looking at it. So I've got some reflections to end on, perhaps some starting points for discussion. And I say it's really discussion rather than questions that we're looking for after our short break in the next half hour. And one is reading around environmental history and Andrew Eisenberg's work. And one of the things he talks about is how is history different to, for example, what literary people do. I mean, one of the striking things actually is of the best history is now coming out of English literature departments, geography departments, many other departments. It's absolutely not limited to history departments at all. But he hones in on change, causation, contingency. I think all things quite familiar and interesting people with a scientific background, such as myself, but also something I think is perhaps often missing in our work, historical context. People thought different in the past. They acted in different circumstances in the past. And it's no good homing in on a small ethnobotanical story if you don't take the trouble to look at that wider context. And we're really lucky in London, not only have lots of wonderful historians, but also Senate House Library, University of London. It's always my starting point, the old Institute of Commonwealth Study libraries, looking at things like 1950s, 1960s books of economic history. And in my opinion, economic history is an undervalued academic field. It sounds so dull, and yet it explains so much about how the world works. And particularly if you look at those older books, so well written and full of really interesting primary data, including ideas around causation. I think, as I've said, diverse approaches are really important in English literature, geography, history, anthropology, archaeology, different tools. And again, that tells us we need to collaborate in this work. As one of the essays in this very inspiring book, What is History Now? The successor to Carr's classic work as read by all history students forever. The people who wrote this book really are taking the opportunity to sell their subjects. It's very, very beautifully written. One of the points that's made by one of the authors in this book is that publications is the start, not the end of the conversation. The history is always being rewritten as new historians appear with new questions and new sources. And we really need to diversify the range of historians who are working at Kew. There's a common theme amongst much of the work I've described around hidden histories, around lost practices, around restitution to societies of that knowledge and those practices. And that I think can also lead us to different ways of thinking about the world, thinking about that nature society divide, and the introduction of the word caring into our mission statement, perhaps. I think I would like to keep a place for wonder in our work. I was just looking at Ruth Stungo here, with whom I'm working on a book on baskets in the collection. And we're looking about that transformation from raw material to finished product. And the human ingenuity and the beauty of something like a cocoa de mer leaf basket from the Seychelles is extraordinary. So we need to find ways of understanding that objects are often embedded in trade and colonialism, in labor practices, but are also remarkable documents about interaction with the nature world, natural world. Two more points to end. One that I've just discussed, a tiny fraction of the possible work. And I realize I've also not mentioned people such as Tinda van Andel, who through her work at Naturalis in Leiden, amongst many other people, a big inspiration to what we do here, quite like-minded in many respects. And then to end with a message for the Kent students. As you can see here, we've popped into almost 100,000 specimens. We've looked at 10 or 20 today. Ethnobotany, human engagement with plants over time, it is a huge subject, and it's something replete with possibilities. Be the first person looking at something, real opportunities for exciting and novel work. I'm going to end with one more thing, but I had a statement up at the beginning. There is no more significant pointer to the character of a society than the kind of history it writes or fails to write. And that is from the original Carr's book, What is History? And I suppose my ambition from what we're doing at Kew is that there won't be people looking back in 50 years' time say, why didn't Kew, or why didn't the discipline of ethnobotany write its history? Thank you very much. So So this is a good question. I'll repeat the questions for our Zoom audience. What would we do with museum number 2 when we've eased out horticulture into far more luxurious quarters? In fact, they were based in the Jodrell Laboratory at one time. And I think there are examples around. When I think of the Great Gallery of Evolution, the Natural History Museum in Paris, has done brilliant work with the overall museum, but also galleries of taxidermy about renaming and rethinking those. So this is kind of one positive answer. There's a negative answer, I think, about the old plants and people display that we used to have at Kew from 1998 to 2016, and it was a nicely done display, but I realized every time I went to it, it didn't tell the stories I wanted it to tell. It was very vanilla. It was very, here are plants of uses, and it didn't lead you to inquire and to think about the implications perhaps of those uses or the supply of that plant. And I think I'd hope that we could do two things. I think firstly, I mean, oddly enough, because most of what we look after is brown, it's dead plant. But if you look at it the right way, it is often it's amazing. And I would like to experiment with ways of re-inviting people to look at baskets, for example, with Ruth's input, or the little netsuki-like things we have made from peach stones and so on. I think museums don't always do well enough on that, on drawing the visitor in to really concentrate on an object. I think the bigger stories, we are there again coming back to the world of art, and we're coming to the extra activities. So I'm currently in interesting conversations with people working in environment and development who say, well, stories are not telling at Kew. Those stories are being told at Kew, but they're being told, in evening events and talks, for example, or in temporary installations, because there's a limit to how many stories you can pack into a garden. But there is an opportunity. The advantage of the museum is you've got walls, which of course you haven't got in the garden. So I think I'd like to see probably something that's more or less permanent, insofar as you can be a plant material, that really led you to engage with material culture, because I've come to realize through, that's very well articulated by people like Sarah Longair, around how we're using objects as history. We just did it naturally, so a museum curator, but I discovered later it's quite a special thing to do. But also perhaps changing displays, but encourage people, to make those connections, which are hard to quantify. It's hard to pin down historians on exactly how the past results in the present, although it's highly obvious in the core of all historians' work that is the case. And this is where I ended. I didn't explain my last slide, which was what happens when you release a group of basket makers in the collection for a week. I mean, they tied it up beautifully at the end, but I wanted to talk about the importance of allowing mess in research. But what we're doing, the humanities, doesn't lend itself to beautiful programmatic work. It lends itself to experimentation. I suppose I'd like the museum to have room for experimentation. So what led us to the tours about London docks? We had two starting points. One is the London Tea History Association. Website is there, run by retired tea people, whose mission it is to ensure that Britain's engagement with tea is not forgotten. And it's a huge engagement. I was very lucky to be invited to the tea trade dinner at the Savoy a couple of weeks ago. And it was both a very delicious and lovely event, but it was a huge event. It was over 300 people. It's still a very important industry in Britain, but mostly out of sight since the end of the tea auctions. But we also used a guide by Ernest Bramah, who founded the Bramah Tea and Coffee Museum, a warehouse in Bermondsey. Unfortunately, he died, and I believe the contents are still there. There's a problem with individual museums museums who came from that trade and wrote a actually hopelessly over-detailed guidebook. It would take you a month to follow. So Aurora and I picked out books. We went to the National Library of Scotland website where you can download these fantastic 25-inch maps of London. We went to all the usual databases for London pictures. And so in some cases, like the Cut the Street warehouses, the old East India Company warehouses next to Liverpool Street Station, which I had discovered with Layla Redpath, a blue badge guide who runs wonderful East India Company tours. No, they're an extraordinary sort of big brick manifestation. Other cases like East India House, or no, tragically, the East India docks, which are overseen by huge server buildings, and then there's a bit of wasteland and a sort of half-hearted attempt at a nature reserve. So you have to do a lot of preparation, I would say, go do a lot of projecting to make the experience rich. But I mean, I thought I knew the city of London and indeed Docklands quite well, but I discovered a lot of new bits that I hadn't seen before. So we're in discussion with the London Tree History Association about how to take that work forward. I mean, at least get some kind of PDF out, because we could save other people some of the unnecessary walks that we did and guide them towards the most interesting things. And remember, we've also got outside Docklands things like the Twinings shop and museum on the Strand. Fortnum and Mason's. Fortnum and Mason started giving tea to Kew in 1853, and the archives were destroyed in the Second World War, and are still giving us tea today. So, I mean, it is about, now I'm a coffee drinker, I'm afraid to admit, but tea is still really important in British culture and British life, and always has been. The aim of the London Tea History Association is to see that made manifest, to see it more visible than it is at the moment. Yeah, so the question is drawing an example of sand bushman and perhaps plants such as Hydia, for example, is a very well-known case. How do you handle commercial information? So, you know, one of the changes in the nature of a collection, and one of the reasons I changed my job title last year, is we don't do economic botany anymore. The collection is rooted in it, but we do very different, very culturally oriented things today. We do have intersections with makers and designers, for example, but not at the level of knowledge appropriation or at the level of inspiration. And so, if you like, we sidestep that a bit, but the similar conversations nonetheless would always take place around, you know, what a community wishes to reveal. So in that textbook for Amazon schools, there's a lot of information about the significance of the objects, but as Lindsay will remember, our Indigenous anthropologist who led on that angle of the project held long conversations with his colleagues and other groups around what is appropriate to put into a school book, what isn't appropriate to put into a school book, because once it's out in a school book, it's out. Well, a lot of knowledge is indeed already out there. So, I mean, some of the sort of fundamental aspects of working ethically with your very early conversation is what's going to happen to the information with a balance, and that there is a balance that is recognized within the communities that we work with. But if you keep information completely secret, it may be lost. So how commercial is it? How sensitive is it? What do you, the community, wish to release? So there's a very nice quote in What is History Now by Charlotte Lydia Riley, a young historian, whose work I love. But the past is the totality of what happens, and history is the stories that historians tell about the past. And so we are, of course, all generating historical materials as we live, and you know, some of those will survive and some won't. Well, I think there are interesting, I think, you know, Carol and I would probably agree that it's easier to find out what was going on at Kew in 1892 but in 1992. But as email comes in and isn't archived, it is that extraordinary Victorian correspondence, the 8 posts a day in London, the letters flying back and forth, simply doesn't exist. It exists, up until the 1980s when it really tails off. So how are people going to find us? And it is worth thinking about your personal archive. I suppose from a material culture point of view, we raised a big and interesting subject. I'm going to add one more point on it, which is if you are collecting material culture, which I warmly encourage you with the support and the professional communities that you work with to do, it's a really, as the Victorians understood, a really good way of encapsulating information. And as, for example, Ruth and our basket project has demonstrated, get information, or Tapper project, get information back out of it, is that whatever you do, please do not put your own collections into your wardrobe and then die, because your family will throw them away into a dumpster. We have, in fact, had one occasion in Edinburgh in a dumpster, in a rubbish tip, retrieving material that already been thrown out. So please think about the long-term home for your collection. Very likely, if you have been collecting, we've been collecting 2 sets, one that stays in the country of origin, please, and one that you might bring home with you as a study collection. When you think about the home for that study collection, there are many considerations. Who will look after it? Where will it be used? But please give it somewhere while you're alive. And so when I think about, for example, our most fantastic recent donations, Jenny Balfour Paul's indigo collection, being used by one of our PhD students on a right at the moment, that was given to us while Jenny is still in excellent health, is to be able to review the catalogue entries, review the significant statements, correct all the errors that we introduced. And if she wasn't around, we wouldn't be able to do that. So label anything you collect and make sure you find a good home for it. And that creates work and opportunities for future students. It's a good question. So Caroline asks, how have the collections been perceived during my time, which is now seems to grow by year over year, starting 1999. So in fact, I started on the 18th of October, so almost exactly 23 years ago. And I think it's part of a bigger pattern of change. And if I'd had more time, I would have talked about a wonderful book, not read much today because of its title, Plants, Man and Life, published in the 1950s, but man in those days understood as humanity, in which there's a whole chapter in this book on how botanists have turned their backs on humankind and are going increasingly desperately up to mountaintops and stuff to get away from human influence, without of course, not understanding, as recent published work has shown, about 80% of the world's land surface has been heavily modified by humans, and you cannot escape from humans. So there was a turning away from humanity in the 20th century. And I think that was visible to me in the herbarium when I arrived here, and it made the economic botany collection seem an outlier, with the exception of some members of staff, David Goyders somewhere, now outstanding exceptions to that rule. Whereas now everybody in science at Kew is working on useful plants, so there are no exceptions to that. And the economic botany collection are the methods that you need to interrogate it, which come absolutely from science, but also come from arts, humanities, and social sciences, are also the methods that we use more widely in Kew science, because we recognize that the keys to conservation are combining the power of scientific analysis and ecological understanding with community knowledge and a community willingness to engage in conservation. You can't separate these. Why biocultural conservation is such a useful term. So I don't know what people say about the collection when I'm not there, of course, but it is increasingly widely used within Kew itself, and I know it has fans at a high level. And I think, again, riding on the back of a better understanding about how we do botany and plant sciences in general, we've benefited from that change. So how do we see the future for repatriation and restitution Yep. Oh, okay. Where do we see those? Let us say. So I'm going to say it's a question we could discuss all night. I will try to give you an answer, but I think that as do perhaps most of the museum community, naturally enough, that museum collections have value. I've tried to demonstrate that this evening. Uh, I think there are a number of conditions that you need to fulfill to keep a museum collection, but it must be used, but it must be accessible to source communities. And we've got a lot of work to do on that at Kew around digitization, as well as the other forms of access, the scholarships and visits, this kind of thing. You need to show that you understand stewardship. You need to show that you'll manage a collection in a way that's respectful to all of the donors and everybody who's represented in that collection. If you meet those conditions, I think there is a justification, there's a purpose to having particularly global collections. I hesitate to say universal collections. At the same time, the Arts Council released a recent report on repatriation, not hugely different from the earlier version in 2000, but to my eyes, the difference in the new version is that repatriation is now a normal activity in European museums, and certainly in British museums. It simply takes place all of the time, but it takes place with certain categories of materials, sacred and secret objects, for example, objects of great cultural value to the source community, objects that were stolen, which is the minority of what's in UK museums, but is present at Kew as well as other museums, but in quite small quantities. The way that botanists work is generally embedded in communities. It's a different style of working, I would say. And in those circumstances, repatriation is completely normal. In order for those requests to take place, and they come at the request of the community, the collections need to be known. And so the very first step in repatriation, the unglamorous bit, but I think is often overlooked, is around transparency. And this is something we're working quite hard on with our entry books. We've moves to get all of Kew's collections online, including the Economic Botany collection, is the first step. And then seeing where with communities the conversations go. So going back to the messy table, this is where new work and new ideas are forged through complicated conversations. But it's super important to be open. Yeah, so it's a really good question as well. What are the implications for, should anthropology be working more with biocultural collections, or indeed making new collections? And I think here I would say that there are different traditions in British anthropology, and there's a tradition around environmental anthropology, for example, that aligns very well with the kind of work we were doing. In fact, we have a PhD proposal in with an environmental anthropologist at Goldsmiths to work on rubber or other tropical crops in West Africa. There's a natural sympathy, if you like, there. Whereas the social anthropologists, including those who work in material culture, whereas sometimes bridge building to be done in terms of language and understanding why things are important. But in the world of museum anthropologists in the Pitt Rivers or University of East Anglia and the Sainsbury Centre are very well understood. So I absolutely do think that anthropologists could work more with this kind of material and could be actively collecting more of it, as perhaps their European and American cousins still do. And I'm hoping again we put in a proposal with UCL anthropology for another PhD next year. That is all part about bridge building, about introducing each other to collections, and about a bigger picture. And all of the things we're discussing tonight take place in a bigger vision of plant humanities at Kew that we've been developing with colleagues at Royal Holloway and elsewhere, which is how do you make that work happen? And a lot of it is around language and willingness to change working practices and engage with new ways of doing things. And the collaborations that work well for us, and I think we've become quite skilled now at identifying those and putting in the work to make them happen, where both sides adjust and look at new ways of trying things out.